Okie dokie.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a beautiful Wednesday evening. Welcome to Looking Deeper with the Reverend Sandra Herrick and yours truly, Denise Dana, King Francisco. It is great to be with all of you tonight. The chat room is now open. Good evening, Sandy Herrick.
How you doing, Dana?
Good.
Good to be back. It's been a while.
Yeah. Life's been happening.
Oh my God. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
And Ash Wednesday for
And
those
Ash
that
Wednesday,
celebrate. Yeah, today's Ash Wednesday.
Fat Tuesday, and giving anything up for Lent?
I think this year for Lent, I'm really trying to give up plastics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm going to try to use less plastics and to be very conscious of whatever I purchase not being in plastic.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a good one.
Well, what about you, Sand?
I haven't thought about it. Oh, God. Maybe give up swearing.
Well, that's a good one.
I've been swearing a lot the past few months.
Well, that's a good one. Stop cussing.
Oh, my goodness. Stop cussing. Get that New York attitude out of my Southern Connecticut person.
Yeah, so I'll be...
It's like, there's a go-to. Obviously, you can imagine what it is.
I kind of sort of know.
It has O in front of it.
Yeah, I've seen it and heard it a few times in all these years.
This is true.
Somebody...
It just comes out naturally, so I'll have to put my brain on pause.
Somebody asked me the other day how long you and I have been doing this radio gig, and it's 12 years this year.
Good God. Good. And not only radio, I mean the online programs, the classes, the galleries, the traveling back and forth, the yours place, my place. I mean, there's a catalog of things that we have done that's really quite major.
Absolutely. I know Dane and Melissa are headed down to Asheville. And he said, well, you and Sandy have been to Asheville. And I said, Sandy and I have been to Asheville a couple of times together for speaking engagements there at the community college.
God.
So we've been around the block, as they say.
We have been around the block. And what a block it's been.
It's been a hell of a block.
It's been a good block. Okay.
Well, I look
forward to more, whatever it brings. I mean, and if you think about how, and I have to giggle because time is so... When we're in time, it takes way too long. But if you look back, it's like lickety split. And if you look in the future, it's like, when's it going to get here? So it's
right.
I can't believe that much time has happened. It feels like it's a wink of an eye. Really, the blink of an eye. It's astounding. So, yeah. Well, I hope they have a spectacular journey.
Well, I'd like to begin by talking about a spectacular journey. Welcoming everybody who's already in the chat room. The chat room is filling up very quickly.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, Rhonda, Carla Jo, Lady Hawk, Janice Francisco. Come on in, everybody. It's always delightful. Exactly. In the chat room. So tonight, Sandy, I just had this inkling that it might be kind of nice, and not just because today is Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent, and yesterday was, Punchki Tuesday. as we say here in West Michigan. But talking about holding sacred space for everyday life. Because, life is life. Everything happens in life as it happens. Some we have control of, some there's no control whatsoever. And all of it, to me anyway, is sacred in one form or another. So talking about how do we make time to make life sacred, or do we look at life as sacred? Do we look at life as a cheap thrill ride that we're at the whim of the fates, if you will? So talking about the sacredness of everyday life, how does that sound to you?
Absolutely perfect, because you and I just mentioned before the show that we tend kind of the parallel universes with life and death, and the call of being aware of how fragile everything is and how sacred everything is in the second by second, at moments when we're distracted by, oh, I'm feeling happy and isn't life wonderful? It's like, oh my God, this is a moment where I have to pause and really focus, because life is wonderful and it's also dangerous, and it's also one of those things where every moment is sacred when you realize how precious it is. And what I was speaking of, with the birth of your grandchild, with Todd going through his operations, and Bobby being diagnosed with cancer. And so there's that place where I think even what brings you to the idea of what sacred is, and when do you turn to it as, I need to be there now, or I'm always in it. And, yes, everything is sacred. And I have to be honest, I'm not always in it as a sacred thought, but I'm always aware that my thoughts find a sacred gesture throughout the day. It's woven throughout the day.
Talk about that for a minute, Sandy. What does that mean for you?
It means, I can go back in retrospect to being a Catholic child, born and raised Catholic, what it means to go to church on Ash Wednesday and be blessed with the ashes of the burned palms from Easter the year before, the incense, the prayers. And sacred to me as a child was very much going to church, being in a ritual of kneeling, praying, and asking for hope and prayers to be answered, or to be seen as a child worthy of belonging to, when I die, heaven, or in the moment to the sacredness of how the nuns would see me, or the, whatever, all that stuff. Very naive, very aligned with what it means to be good, really what it means to be good. And so church was sacred. Prayer at night was sacred. In growing up, what became sacred was nature. In, the 60s, becoming more aligned with human nature and the rebelness of what does it mean to be free, to have free thought, and to include spirituality now, not just religion, but spirituality. And so what it means to me as I've grown up is that I weave throughout the day that consciousness. There's the sunrise. There's a color in the sky. There's something on the grass. When I look at the animals out in the back, when I find an object, just before we started talking, I picked up my pendulum here next to my chair in my office and realized, God, this has done a lot of sacred energy work. And weaving in and out means, that's an interesting, it just caught my brain. Like the thread of gold that comes from my consciousness over to the sacred energy, and it weaves back toward me, comes through me, through my consciousness, through my body, and weaves back to it. So that infinite energy that moves back and forth in the figure 8, that includes me and also holds me as an independent. What about you?
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's beautiful. And as you're describing it, I'm in New Hampshire in the autumn with my favorite yellow tree in your back. They're at the foot of the mountains. And I can picture what it was that you were describing. which is exquisite. And for me, holding sacred space is very similar. In the morning, I do light candles and I do have prayerful intentions every single morning for those that I love, those that I care about, and those whom they love. So I do go through the morning ritual of lighting candles and lifting prayers. And like you, I am always looking out of the windows here at the Enchanted Forest or walking out in the forest. And I've learned, for me particularly since the left brain stroke in 2004, that nothing should ever be taken for granted.
Exactly.
And so when I see something spectacular, it can be something as simple as a pileated woodpecker on a tree out in the forest, and I will stop and I will watch, and I know that that moment for me is sacred. And so when we think about that word sacred, some people immediately go to religion, but I think that sacred also has a larger meaning. I believe that it means that something is special or that it's revered or that it's heartfelt. How would you define sacred, Sandy?
Well, the way that you're describing it and the way that I feel it in that description, and it brings clarity to my own awareness in the pause, a place to come and pause, or all of a sudden the divine energy that we're looking at in nature or in rooms or sanctuaries, candlelight, you realize it's not something that is casual. It's something that is captivating. And it takes away from us the mundane and brings us into an awe place where we can literally lay down something that is too heavy to carry, or we can pick something up that needs to be brought closer to us. For me, that sacredness of the way you were describing the woodpecker, it is that pause. The sunrise for me is that I pause after sleeping. I pause and I wait for that sun to come. It's a communion that, and interestingly enough with the moon, there's that place of I pause, I'm in awe, and I belong to everything. And in sacred space, I do know for a fact that it belongs to us. It's available to all of us. And when we step into it, it brings us into that place of feeling we're joined. We have a touchstone. We're remembered, or we can start remembering. And you're not alone in sacred space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never alone, even if I'm alone.
Mm-hmm.
In sacred space, I'm not alone. So as you lighting a candle, to me, there's always that revere of spiritus. It needs the flame, it needs the spark, it needs the air. In prisms, being in that light, when all of a sudden you stand in a church and the light comes through the colored glass, the stained glass. I mean, depending on the smallness of the church or the grandness of the chapel or the cathedral, it takes my breath away. And so I am paused by sacred. It demands me in a very gentle way to forget my busyness or anything that would distract me from it.
I like that. It does distract us from busyness, even the busyness of mind.
Yes.
For a brief moment, I like the word communion.
Yes.
Being at one with a thought, or what do I want to say? Something
maybe
that
an issue.
Yeah.
Maybe an issue, because I know that we come to our knees. We really do. We come to our knees when things are really, really, really challenged in that place of all I can do is stop. I stop the busyness, I stop even the control or hoping I control, and go into something so simple to connect in the sacredness. And whether I say a prayer or hold a crystal or read something, it's to bring me to a place of being poignant, of being very clear that even there is need for silence. That sacred is not always let me leave a prayer. It's let me be vacant so a prayer can come to me, or I can be washed so I can start rethinking again when I get up and leave.
That's beautiful.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, our beautiful friend Rhonda Joy, Joy, and you know Rhonda in the chat room, is saying, I love the days that I feel happy just to be alive. It awakens my sacredness, especially now with breast cancer.
Oh, God bless your heart, Rhonda.
She's walking through the journey of breast cancer. And, you know, I'm glad, we're thrilled that you're alive and you're going to continue to be alive. And we're all here holding that sacred space for you to walk this journey, holding you in love, of course, Rhonda, all of us. But I love the honesty in what you're sharing, because sometimes for some of us, it takes having a crisis of health or a crisis in relationship to bring us to a place where all of a sudden, even mundane moments, even waking up and breathing becomes sacred.
You're absolutely right. There's that truth of what brings us to the awareness that life is not forever, that this is a moment-to-moment experience. It's not just a blur, that this is something so precious that it can be given to us and taken from us at any moment. And, you know, our brains are trained somehow to forget our mortality. And it's life situations that bring us back to the reality of that. And it is amazing what happens when we realize that our mortality is up for grabs at any moment. So whether it's something we face personally or we're involved with, like with Rhonda, in joining in and holding space with you. And it's also important for me to ask people when I have them as clients or whatnot, what is sacred to them, so I don't invade them with my own sense of what's sacred, but provide that space of collaboration. So, you know, right now there are so many different venues of phenomena or psychic phenomena or ways for faith to express itself. It's really amazing for sacredness now to have a larger menu in ways that we believe and practice. And so, you know, who goes to the mountain, who goes to the cave, who goes to the river, who goes to the desert. Sacred is so atmospheric also. Don't you find that?
Oh, without a doubt. Earlier today, I was interviewed by Jennifer Ann, and one of her first questions to me was about the definition of enchantment. And I believe sacred is very similar to enchantment because there's a feeling.
Yes.
And sometimes sacred isn't anything that we've planned upon, but sacred and the feeling of sacred can be evoked.
Right.
And, you know, like you, growing up in a very Catholic family, and, you know, once you're born into Catholicism, you are always a Catholic, I believe. I mean,
if the plane goes down, I will make the sign of the cross. I will not go Om Shanti Om.
Exactly. And of course, I have no problem. I have no issues whatsoever with having been raised Catholic at all. At all. And so the moment that I step into a church or a cathedral anywhere around the world, and I begin to smell incense, or I find the Lady Chapel, I am magnetically drawn to the Lady Chapel to light a candle. and to be in prayer. And for heaven's sakes, if somebody within that church begins to sing the Ave Maria, well, I'm done with.
Exactly.
I'm a puddle on the floor. Somebody will have to come and mop me up. That even happened in Cairo, Egypt. So at the Church of the Apparition. So there are certain scenarios, smells, songs that evoke a sense of sacred. And sometimes, frankly, I have those same feelings when I am at sacred ceremonies out on the reservation, inside Sweat Lodge. There are certain, and oftentimes I believe sacredness is evoked with smell.
Absolutely. There's that place of we can smell dank, we can smell innocence, we can smell purity, and we can also smell creation.
Yeah.
And, so scent is something that it pulls us in and it repulses us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about sanctuary that we're pulled to it. It has a magnetic quality to it that allows us to stumble into it when we're in the dark night of the soul, or when we're wandering and we're lost and we need some reference. And, and that I would call the sign, when all of a sudden there's a sacred sign, and that sign is so illuminated, whether it's just a glint from the sun that says there's more here than the dark, or if it's a blazing sign.
Mm-hmm.
One of my great stories is I was coming from California and got on a plane and needed to know if I was going to go visit this person that invited me to the Bahamas, and it was like, and it was a life-changing moment. It wasn't a random decision. It was like, should I, could I, would I, will I? And I'm on the plane and thought, about this invitation I received. And I opened the magazine from the plane, and the page is, "Come to the Caribbean."
That's a sacred moment.
I mean, you laugh your ass off, but then it was like, okay, I think it's a sign. I'm close to heaven.
Up in that plane. Oh, there you go. It dropped right in your lap, literally.
Hey, this could go either way.
That's fantastic. I've never heard that one before.
So it's just that what is a sacred sign? And it can make you giggle, but it's still the sacred voice.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that place where sacred can be profoundly quiet, where even if you sneeze, it's interrupting the stillness. And there's the sacredness of laughter, where you realize that it brings you to tears and it brings the relief from the overwhelming pain.
Mm-hmm.
So gestures, emotions are sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that, like you say, when you hear the song Ave Maria, what is the emotion it evokes inside you to make you cry?
Right. And I've never been able to explain that. I don't know if it's lifetimes ago or something in my memory bank that I'm just not able to access. Yes. But there is something about hearing that song, and sometimes even hearing a symphony play it, or piano, or what have you. There's something about all of that. And
yes.
One of the things I've noticed in my life with regard to sacred responds really well to gratitude.
Yes.
I know for myself, when I find me in a sacred place or having a sacred moment, I always say thank you. I don't even know sometimes who I'm saying it to, but I'm saying it in the moment. Thank you for this moment. And I do that so many times throughout the course of a day.
Yes.
And
that to me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I believe that they work beautifully together.
That part is part of the weaving for me also. And it is you're absolutely right. The gratitude is a moment of that pause where, what am I I thankful for? And what am I saying thank you to?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I am not always aware of what it is, but I know it is aware of me.
Mm-hmm.
Sacred is aware of us. I think I need to, explore that with you here so that everybody realizes that sacred already exists
Mm-hmm.
in knowing all of us and includes us in every second of every moment of our existence, not just one life, our total existence.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget it and remember it, visit it, walk away from it. Sacred is constant. And it is like that God energy that is unconditional. And it allows us the freedom of choice to leave it and to return to it. Some people devote their lives to it in an internal experience, and others stay away from it lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. Do you know people that have stayed away from sacred?
Oh, yes. Because sometimes sacred is equated with mystic or mysticism, the hidden, the esoteric. Sometimes sacred is equated exclusively to Catholicism. And so I know many people who stay away from thoughts of sacred versus thoughts of religion.
Yes.
Like the plague. Absolutely,
Yes.
Sandy. Yeah.
Yeah, we've gone to exactly the same sentence, that it is amazing for me, and I am brave enough and clear enough to say there are religions out there that are not sacred at all. They're sacrilegious in my experience of their judgment and their criticism and their defiance to include and have unity with humankind.
Yes.
And to me, there is that radical humanness or the inclusiveness of everything is sacred. And it is striking to hear people that condemn sacredness because of judgment and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm sure I've smelt smoke at my feet lifetime after lifetime.
I think I was there with you at least once.
I'm sure it was like, I'm sure glad you got that pedicure.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. So, and even that tire is sacred. We may giggle or laugh, but in that moment when someone is damned or persecuted, that tire becomes sacred because they do not leave what it is inside them that connects them to the faith of what is holy and sacred to them. And it is amazing when somebody is radical enough to say, I will not give up my faith for your faith. I will not believe that you have the only God or the only way of life. Then the people who say you have to concede are the very people that damn the people that say, no, I belong to something that's more inclusive than your idea.
Yes.
So, we may be going down another pathway here, but that's sacred conversation also on how we have to fight to keep our sacredness, and how many times you have to go to the cave to hide your sacredness, or go to the glen, or dance in the dark. How many tribes do you know held their sacred ceremonies and prayer out of the fear of in secrecy, out of the fear of having their tongues cut out, or their be brutalized for saying what was sacred in their language?
Absolutely. Carla Joe is saying in the chat room, in my case, I shy away from religion and search out the sacred. And Rhonda is saying that, her too. I think more and more people are avoiding religion, actually.
Well, there's definitely a divide.
Yeah.
Things are kind of radical right now.
Yeah, they are.
It's kind of showing its own colors. And those that are in that holy roller rock and roll, or in their idea of what is sacred, and God bless, are rallying to the might of their fight. And those that are saying, well, there's other ideas and idealizing energies and ways of experiencing and expressing humanity, love, and faith, we're rising also. I mean, I do say we're because I'm in that domain.
Mm-hmm.
Also ancient sacredness, going to an ancient sacred site. I live in New England, and so there is ancient history here for the Pilgrims, for the Native Americans. If you go to South Dakota, there's ancientness there. If you go to Mexico, we've both been to Egypt, and for me, one of the most sacred places was, even though I went to be with Sekhmet, what was more phenomenal, or equally phenomenal, and the surprise of sacred, was when I sat on the stones of the pyramid at the base of the king's and queen's chamber. I did not go in, but I sat by myself on one of those great massive stones and communed in the full moon with the other pyramids and have photographs that are breathtaking, realizing I'm sitting someplace that was placed 5,000, how many thousands of years ago, and it waited for me to return. And my back is against it right now, and I'm here in the dark. Egyptians walking around with machine guns,
Mm-hmm.
guards, and being polite and respectful to, are you okay? Yes. And leaving me alone.
Mm-hmm.
Dwelling in that surprise that universe right there in that moment remembered me and allowed me to remember that I was being remembered.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a discovery of, oh, I'm in Egypt. It was like, oh, here's Egypt.
I'm back.
Exactly.
I'm back. Having those spectacular moments of soul remembrance.
Yes.
Lady Hawk is sharing in the chat room that earlier today, she smelled a man's cologne, and only to find out that her cousin had passed away. And she found that sacred. It is amazing how sometimes sacred is a physical bridge, just like that.
Yes.
And it's, the sacred love bond, the sacred love ties that we have with those that have crossed over. Thank you for sharing that, Lady Hawk.
God bless your cousin, sweetheart.
Yeah. She's saying,
go ahead,
she's saying, you two taught me to recognize the gift of knowing. What a gift it is. Thank you. He is okay, and I know that. So that's sacred. Sometimes you have to be still enough to know that sacred is there, because if we're so busy hustling and bustling about our lives and busying our minds, numbing ourselves, we can miss the sacred.
And, there are the sacred journeys. Right now, there are a lot of people that are going into ayahuasca. They're going into the sacred ceremony of ancient ways of hallucinogenics. So, and I bring that up because it's just kind of like I got a flip off the side of my right brain here with when people feel that they can't get there by lighting a candle or saying a prayer, or they want to go into the mind expansion of sacred. It's very important to be able to do that, knowing that, again, we're going into those dimensions with the guidance of people that need to hold the sacred space of the plant that you ingest or that you smoke. That everything is available for exposure to good, bad, up, down, right, wrong, left, right. And that if you're going to do hallucinogenics, if you're going to go into the outer realms to explore, make certain that you have a blessing between yourself and the plant, yourself and the incident that you will create to create a journey. Even in breath work, in meditation, in any process that you use, really create the relationship between you and what you ingest, or the object that you hold, that you open yourself up to. What do you want to say about that, Dana?
Well, in creating that kind of a sacred experience, you are absolutely right. Being with somebody, whoever the facilitator of it is, making sure that they know what they're doing and honoring, the life force of the plant, whether it's ayahuasca or peyote, whatever it happens to be, but really being consciously aware of who you are working with and what you are working with, and also preparing the space for the space that you're going into, so that the space that you enter into is a sacred and holy one and not a holy, oh my God, what just happened to me one. I've never used hallucinogenics. I can't even imagine the way that I am. Even I remember once one of my nephews, before a peyote meeting up on the reservation, said, "Hey, Auntie, are you going to come into the meeting tonight and do the peyote?" And I looked at him and I said, "My life is already full of spirits. I don't think that would be good for me." And he laughed so hard he had tears rolling down his face. And he said, "Oh, that's right. You don't need any of this." And they still chuckle about that today.
Right.
But I do know from, listening to others, that just, if you're going to go into those kind of sacred spaces, to really know what it is that you're doing and who you're doing it with. So I'm glad that you brought it up, Sandy.
Because there are a lot of people that are starting to do it again with, LSD is still out there. Mushrooms are out there. There's certain energies with, it's so old, it's casual on my tongue now, with pot.
Oh.
It's there's so many, and now because it's legal, but still be aware of the fact that this is a plant life that is sacredly grown from Mother Earth with the purpose of offering mind-altering experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's been casually used for recreation, it is now given license for medical support. Mm-hmm. That is sacred.
Yeah.
People are finally being able to get away from the synthetics. Talk about plastics. The synthetics of, let's take Mother Nature, enhance it with something that we can do with it that we have to make in order to make it, a little more toxic, and then a lot of money, rather than go out in the backyard, cut your plant, inhale, and you're better than if you were, sucking down a pill that you spent, $30,000 for these days. It's mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
So Mother Earth is sacred in offering ingestibles. Some are toxic, some are pure. So again, be clear of your journey. Be clear of what the sacredness is. And, I have a few clients that really are in that thrill of, I don't know if thrill's the right word, but I'm going to use it. The thrill of expanding their mind through using hallucinogenics and knowing that they are wanting to walk out into dimensions that they can't get to because they don't have the right brain capacity that you and I do have. You and I are pretty much genius when it comes to the right brain. Yeah. You've got a genius left brain too. Mine's a piece of shit. Sorry. Oh, skip, see?
You're going to give that up for Lent, aren't you, Sandy?
Yeah, right after the show.
You're giving up that negative self-talk for Lent.
Okay, a quarter into the can.
That's right.
So it's one of those things where, because they do have a congestion, or their left brain is their avenue of experiencing life, to expand into the right brain at times takes the leaving the everydayness of stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
You do it through meditation, prayer, isolation by going into deep retreat, silence. I mean, silence is a huge upper I don't know if anybody's done a silent retreat, but it is difficult and it is rewarding.
I've done it, and it's magnificent. I did it at a convent over in Jackson, Michigan here, at a Romanian Orthodox convent. It was spectacular. Especially, you know what was really spectacular? Was the midnight vespers being chanted in Romanian.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That had to take you back to another century.
Well, it did. It was pretty wonderful. On the topic that you've raised, Rhonda is sharing in the chat room that I'm learning that lesson with edible marijuana, especially since I never had any of that ever before the cancer. And she's saying it can put you on your Watusi. Boy, I haven't heard that in a long time. But it is.
How old are you?
I know. She's so darn cute. But she's saying that it helps her to combat insomnia caused by the chemo.
Yes.
Yeah. It is a sacred plant. It really is.
Yes, it is. And so when you ingest it, Rhonda, really realize that Mother Earth is coming into you to stabilize something that has become unstable or disoriented. And so that one of the things that you can do when you lay down to sleep and you have that in your system is to allow the bed to become the angelic feathers that literally hold you, like catching you in your flight and caressing you to sleep. And I've actually had to do that myself, where some night, way back when, I was so in despair that a friend of mine, literally my dear friend Lori, gave me that visual of, because she knew nothing else was going to give me aid, to lay down and feel caught, that you're not alone, that you're not isolated, and you're not abandoned. You're caught. And it was one of the most beautiful moments of peace, because all of a sudden I had a place to rest myself. And respite is sacred space. And the ability to be held, be contained, allow your mind to be listened to in a way that you can't even speak it, so that you know that it can even stop screaming. Mm-hmm. It just goes quiet. Mm-hmm. So, big stuff.
Big stuff. Sacred is where we find it, and sacred is where we give gratitude for it and recognize it. And Janice Francisco is also saying that chanting gives her chills.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And drumming.
And drumming. Rhonda is saying, I love Sandy's advice. She is right on.
Oh, sweetheart, thank you very much. I will see you in your dreams.
And Carla Joe is saying, chanting, Inipi songs, etc. takes me to a place long ago and far away.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And, sacred space, let's talk about the Inipi. Sacred space to go into the Inipi and know that, and we have to be very vigilant here, because there are people in the past 10 years or so that were using sweats as a publicity stunt and allowing themselves to be considered shamanic, and they were not, and it was dangerous, and inappropriately what was sacred was now dangerous to the human life. And people passed away. And I'm very, very grateful that in your Inipis, Dana, there is that place of, it's a covenant. There is the dark is contained. It's not frightening. Where the sweat is a caress, it's not a suffocation. Where and I have living proof of what it's like to be in total dark and see the outlines of faces and hear the experience of nature singing through and to us, that there's that place where you realize it expels the evil from us, or the fractures of what we would consider our sins, or allow us to feel that we are being made whole, rather than dismembered from any of the radical doings in our lives or doubts or fears. And it simplifies something to purify a moment, to say, we can begin again. There's a forgiveness. There's a gratitude for being forgiven. So it's like a confessional.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a really great point as well, that sacred is sometimes abused and misused.
Yes.
And misusing and abusing sacred is detrimental on a soul level. I remember years ago when Sister Irene Mary, when she was helping me to really, get to know how to use my gifts, she said to me, and I repeat this often, always remember, Denise, that you're working with people's souls and you're working with their hearts, and that is sacred. And I've never forgotten that, because I have encountered those people in those times where I have been made aware of people under the auspices of sacred were actually hurting other people. And we read about it all the time in the newspapers and all of that kind of a thing. But being discerning about where we go to find sacred, or who we think we've found sacred in, is a good thing. Discernment is always a good thing.
Right. And, the hardship of not understanding, wanting to belong, that's what creates cults, where someone doesn't know how to experience life, and so they go and get involved with a mother-father image or a leadership that says, I don't understand God, you will tell me what God says, so therefore tell me what God says because I can't hear God myself. And then we give what is sacred in ourselves to somebody else to behold. And that literally is giving away, in some way, your natural innate gift to hear the songs of the birds, to feel the kiss of the sun, to trust that God or light or holy or sacred speaks to you, whether you're aware of it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we go too many times to someone and say, what is God saying to me? To me, that means I don't trust that I have a relationship with sacred. Someone more sacred than me has to give me the information. And we're trained to do that as children, to go, come here and we'll anoint you. Be here and we'll grace you. You can only get it through me. Mm-hmm. And that is, when you hear that, that's salesmanship.
Yep.
That's not sacred.
That is salesmanship. Oh my goodness.
And a lot of people want that because they don't want to do the work of having to explore, because it is difficult sometimes. Mm-hmm. There are people that I know that are so innocent and knowing. God bless. I'm gonna say my friend Suzanne, who lives in New Zealand. You are one of the most sacred people I know. She never really had to read a book. She never had to do a journey. She just knew it. She felt it. She was there. Her bliss and her joy and her goodness exudes everywhere. And people around her are like, I got to have that book. I got to go to the next retreat. I got to go down. And it was like, why aren't you doing this? And she goes, because I know. I don't want to do that. I'm already here. Mm-hmm. And she's right. Some of us are born into it. And I think we're all born into it. Mm-hmm. If I'm really going to be honest, we're all born into it. And our journey in any sacred journey is, what do we do with it?
Right.
Sacred space really is that generous. It lets us figure out how to leave it, come back to it, stay with it, or forever be without it. And it doesn't need us to exist.
Exactly. And it exists not only here in the physical world, of course, the non-physical world, but it also exists in our dream time.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about that for a little bit this evening, about how sometimes the sacred comes to visit us or we go to visit it while our body is sleeping. And, one rule of thumb that I've often used is that if I wake up fully remembering a dream, then by golly, there's something, or even a good chunk of it, then there's something in there that I need to inspect. What about you, Sandy?
Well, there's been many times I call and say, so I had a dream about you last night.
That's very true. Yeah.
And it would go into a conversation that would be, oh my God, all right, oh my God. And whether it was a premonition or a healing from a past life or even an assignment, those were sacred conversations that elevated our awareness of each other, or even finding out how the bond was more expansive than we understood. And so there's that beauty of the sacred, the thread again, in my subconscious. I truly believe in my subconscious and my unconscious that I have more sacred experiences than I do in my conscious mind. Because that's where I'm not inhibited down there. It's connected to the great universe. It's in that wealth of really belonging without me having an attitude about it. And so it brings me into places that show me where I'm scared or need to work something out, with the safety of I'm still in my body. I can still find my body. And I still have my common sense or wits about me. Or people like you or others that I can call and say, wait a second, something happened. Because it will explain, even if it's a dark dream or a shadowy dream, how to come back to sacred, how to find the light or the cure.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and get some more water, so you're going to travel to the faucet with me.
Okay.
Okay, talk about sacred waters.
Well, and there is that too.
Yeah, so let's talk about where are some of the sacred places that you have been that really brought to you the awareness that you're ancient.
Well, Egypt, of course, and the Badlands of South Dakota. I think more than probably anywhere there in the Badlands. On the reservation and around in that area. And also in places like Avebury in England, Avebury Henge, and some of the stone circles in Ireland and places in Scotland. I feel as though when I go to those places, I'm visiting myself from perhaps another lifetime, or perhaps, I believe all time is now, that I'm jumping tracks of time, stepping onto a different track of time. And I believe that sometimes we're drawn to those sacred places and sacred spaces because there's more to learn, or there's a remembrance that needs to be had. But sometimes just sitting even in the sweat lodge without it being covered brings me to a space where I know that I've been there before. And this feels...
Talk about the grid.
Yeah. The first time that I ever sat inside a sweat lodge, oh my goodness, 30 years ago, I felt, not quite 30, 25 years ago, I felt very much at home. And so sometimes it's right in my own backyard, literally, out in the forest, where that is the most sacred of places. And this winter, with everything that's been going on, I haven't been able to be in a sweat lodge or to pour a sweat lodge. And I can say that in all honesty, there is a longing for it, but it has also affected me.
In what way?
For me, being in that sweat lodge, in that sacred space, brings me to center.
Right.
It helps to balance my synapses.
Right.
Because it really is my place between heaven and earth. Right. And I haven't been able to be in it. And sometimes sacred space calls us, and sometimes we literally need to be in that space. When we talk about people um, who go to community, sometimes they are cults, and sometimes we need community. I am so happy always the first day that the School of Sacred Studies opens its doors. Mm-hmm. Because I love talking to everybody in this way, or Zoom meetings or what have you. But when the doors open and everyone starts filing into my house or into the school itself, there is such a feeling of my life being back in balance. And it's all having to do with sacred relationship, sacred space, and the sharing of that. I mean, how do you feel, Sandy, if you go without being in sacred space for too long a time?
Deprived.
Yeah.
Barren.
Yeah.
And it's that it's Lent.
Yeah.
Because there is a detachment from a certain joy or a certain, I'll even say, indulgence, where there's deep pleasure, there's deep that communion, and it is a ritual of harmony that brings a relationship to feel endeared and endearing, and also known. When I'm in sacred space, I feel that space knows me more than I do. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it gives me the balance and the ballast to continue being who I am. Mm-hmm. Or to strive again to get back into myself from whatever has fractured or distracted, or just the naturalness of life itself. I mean, even though this has been a very hectic, challenging, threatening time the past couple of years, literally non-stop, it's the journey of life. It's not punishment. It's not cruelty. It's not poor me. It's just the time to go through something that hones the spirit, carves the soul, and challenges the endurance of our own humanity. Of, well, what do we believe in? What is our faith? What are our consequences, or where's our boundaries, or what's the integrity of our standards, mm-hmm. of how we interact with the challenges of life? We can all be good when it's good, but what is the integrity when the challenges come?
There's a great litmus test right there, and you just said it all. We can all be good when it's good. Ain't that the truth? Let's let everything get ugly for 5 minutes and see what happens.
Exactly. And so, and that, those dark times are sacred space.
Yes, they are.
Sacredness bringing you in to your sacredness that you don't even know you're about to get on your knees. How your knees doing? You're going to be brought down to the ground. I hope you know how to get up.
Better have your CBD oil ready for those knees, because they're going to need it.
You're going to walk that path. I hope you got sneakers.
Yeah.
So it's the drudgery of it does wear us down to our sacredness.
Yes.
Because we start to ask for help. We start to ask for something other than our own will, even though we're willful, but we do surrender into thy will be done. And that is sacred. So sacred to me can be me finally getting under that, into the bed that I love so much, getting under the covers, feeling the pillow, and then talking to God, talking to spirit, mm-hmm. listening. I mean, I know this about you too, that listening to the sounds of the house, mm-hmm. when everything is done, that's mm-hmm. sacred space. Mm-hmm. Listening to when I'm out in the backyard by myself on a summer night, or on a full moon night in the middle of a freezing, cold, bitter, I mean, I'll stand out there naked, and it is sacred. Mm-hmm. it's being in the elements and knowing that I'm raw and it's me with everything. One of the most sacred nights in my life, literally, was the day that we buried my father, December 1st, 1990. The reason why it was one of the most sacred days or nights of my life was it was a full moon. And I had promised my father that I would come back to his grave after all the festivities of, you have the ceremony with the church in the morning. You have we called it a parade because he had Harley Davidson guys with flags and everything else in his motorcade. And, then the burial service, and then you have the gathering and whatnot. And December, the day is short. I got to the grave. I was by myself, and there's the full moon. And I experienced my father everywhere. He was everywhere. He was not in that ground. And there was a love in the air, and I want to say this too, that place of that scent of the fragrance of the cologne. So, Lady Hawk, yeah, that's sacred. Where all of a sudden, the air smelled of a different nectar. And I don't always feel like that in the full moon. But the sacredness of my father being in heaven or heavenly or wherever the boundlessness is of the universe, he let me know how collective. And I think of Carl when I say this. Carl has the presence of that collective.
Carl Franklin.
Yes.
Yes.
He just carries it with him. So that was one of the most sacred moments in my life. And because I was completely exposed. It wasn't in a church, and I've had many episodes. It wasn't at a sacred, it was at graveyard. It's where you lay down and hope you get to where you're going. And so it was one of those moments where the vastness of our existence was shown to me by my father. By my father. So I thank him for that.
I think one of my most recent sacred moments was the first time that I held my grandson and I smelled him.
Oh.
And he's so tiny. I think the first time I held him, he was not even quite 3 pounds.
Good Lord.
And, which is very animalistic for all of us to do, but the first thing that I wanted to do was smell him.
Yeah.
And I held him there in that NICU, and I just leaned into him and I smelled him. And, having his essence brought through me. And I knew that that was a very sacred moment, and probably somewhere in his consciousness, a memory that he will always have as well in his awareness. But I think that I'm glad that you brought up your father's funeral, because sometimes sacred places and sacred spaces aren't necessarily something that can be defined by anyone other than us as we are experiencing it.
Exactly. And you have to hold on to it when it's judged or demeaned or criticized. We can lose our sense of awareness or identity in sometimes wanting to share the story and then someone criticizing it or saying, no way, da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I'm really asking people to hold their ground and to know that there is also a place and time to defend it and or go quiet and go, I'm not going to debate this. Right. Nor will I expose it to someone who wants to make it less than what it is to me. So sacredness can be a boastful thing where you can, here we are talking with great enthusiasm about many of our own sacred moments, and we're able to, really say, hey, this was one of those moments. But I also know some that are so close to my heart, that are so private, that they're still in the folds of my own conscious, subconscious mind. And those sacred moments aren't for the giving, aren't for the, can I tell you something so you can know how important it is to me, or tell me how important it is. Was it important? Validate it for me.
Right.
You know, those are trepidations.
Sometimes sacred is secret.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, the sacred societies, nobody got to go except unless you were invited.
Exactly. Well, Sandy,
you knew the magic word.
That's right. Oh, goodness. Sandy, we're at the top of the hour. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you to everyone that's listening, wherever you happen to be, all of the amazing women in the chat room. Thank you for sharing so beautifully tonight. Sandy, how would you like to leave everyone on this beautiful winter evening?
Well, we're entering into the sacred time that will bring us to Easter, which is very sacred. And however you experience Lent or these sacred nights that bring us into the light, feel the integrity of what it is that you are surrendering to. And know that the other side of this is all that you pray to is looking at you with the answers to your prayers. So I want to thank you, Dana, for holding the sacred space for our radio show. Anybody that wants to find me, go to sandraherrick.com. And I want to really thank the opportunity for not just everybody wanting to be sacred, but knowing that sacred exists and looking for it. So thank you.
Beautifully said. Blessings be, everybody. Have a beautiful evening. Good night, Sandy Herrick.
Good night, Dana. Love everybody.